present. The first one's Jes McBride, and she's going to go over some of the fair housing elements work that she's working on and that a lot of different housing groups in California are collaborating on right now. And then after that, we're going to have Janani Ramachandran, who's running for Assembly District 18. So in the East Bay, she's going to present, and it's going to be kind of a meet and greet and Q&A session with her. So really excited to hear from both of our guests today. I guess we can start by handing it off to Jes to talk about the fair housing elements work.
Okay. Thank you guys for having me. I recognize some of you already as current watchdogs and organizers, so it's really good to see folks like Zoe and Allison, Cliff. You're on the Slack all the time, so but I think it's one of the first times we've been in the same room. So thank you guys for your interest in urban environmentalism, as well as like housing elements as a way to support those values. So I'm going to first ask that you go to our website, fairhousingelements.org, just so you know where our like little home lives on the internet. I'm going to share my screen so we can start presenting. Okay, so can I get a thumbs up? Do you see at least a loading sign? Okay, cool. Thank you. Can I see a show of hands of like, who's ever heard of the housing element process before? I see a thumbs up. Excellent. All right, so some people have heard of the housing element. So I know like a lot of people are like very deep into it, and then other people have never heard about it before. It's something that affects everyone, but as much of housing policy goes, like we don't get trained on housing elements in high school or something in sort of a universal way. So it's up to us to educate each other, right? So this year, it's very new, EMB Action and EMB Law. I work for EMB Law. We started the Campaign for Fair Housing Elements. This is our way to engage in the housing element update process all over the state of California. Every single incorporated city has a housing chapter of their general plan. It's called the housing element, and it needs to be updated every 8 years. And for many reasons, this update cycle has a lot of new things that are really exciting for us who believe that there is a housing shortage, a sprawl problem, all those housing issues that we care about. A lot of them can be addressed in the housing element update process. I'm going to check the chat really quickly. Aha, a general plan. A general plan. What is it? Jonah, do you want to give a definition? Do you have a go-to definition of a general plan?
I don't exactly. Well, it's a thing that the state government requires every local government to do that says their plan for, I don't know, like 10 years or something forward of how they want to grow as a city. And it has a lot of different elements relating to things like transportation and housing and sustainability. And that's about all I got for you.
That's great. That's a perfect, yeah. So basically, if you want to be an incorporated city in California, you have to have a general plan. You have to be hitting these like main things, circulation element, these silly words. Anyway, it's like you have to deal with transportation, noise, housing, these basic things. The state has some required elements, and then you can add in ones that you like, as a city. Like some people have like a health element. And so it's the state's way of saying like, hey, if you want to play at this level and be an actual city, you have to take care of some of the basics of human thriving, right? And we believe that housing is one of those ones. And housing is one that, yes, you have to update every 8 years. And the state gets to sort of have a hand in saying like what goes into the element. It can't just be like, well, we've got all the housing we need, the end, right? It has to accommodate the growth of humans, which we're experiencing. So great question, Joanna. I'll keep my chat up. Okay, so again, we believe in the EMB community that we are experiencing a housing shortage in California. This is resulting in a whole bunch of externalities, bad things that we want to avoid, right? This is causing people to build housing out into the greenbelt, into wildlife areas, wildfire areas. It's creating affordability problems for people. A lot of their resources are going towards their rent. It's causing overcrowding, which in some ways it's fun to have roommates. Other ways, it's not great. During a pandemic, you don't have a place to seclude yourself. It's often, we're at an overcrowding level that is often just not appealing. And so for a lot of reasons, we need to build more housing, and the housing element is a great way to do it, because the state sets the goals for the city instead of just waiting for the developers to try to get their projects through the pipeline. It's an amazing opportunity that we have, right? All of these cities are updating at the same time, especially when it's in a certain region. So is anyone outside of the Bay Area Council of Governments area? Any hands raised? I'm trying to scan the people. Anyway, the housing element update process is done by region. So I'm in Los Angeles right now, which means that all the cities around me have housing elements that are due in October. You guys up in the Bay Area, your housing elements are due in 18 months from now, in January 2023. So that means all the cities in the Bay Area are updating at the same time, which makes it really great for us as housing advocates to activate all at the same time as one coordinated force. So in a nutshell, I know a lot of you know this, but just so that we're all on the same page, the housing element process is a function of the state saying, hey, this region, I think you're gonna grow by this much, based on your overcrowding situation, your affordability situation, and also your job growth, right? That economic growth is a big piece. Based on all of those factors, I think we need to plan for this big number of housing in all of the Bay Area. Then your Council of Governments, for you guys, it's ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments, get together and say, okay, based on this, based on what we know of the cities in our jurisdiction, and based on this big number, how do we divide that up in a fair way, right? So that's that small number that's given to each city is called the RHNA, or the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And from there, cities then take that number of growth and say, where can we accommodate this growth in our city? And not just how can we accommodate the growth of rich people at this number, but how can we also accommodate the growth for people who are making, median income, very low income, or even extremely low income. So it's divided up into various income levels, so that it's not just planning for the rich, but it's planning for everyone. Recent EMB policy wins have created even higher goals. It used to just be sort of what's the economic growth in the region, but now it's also taking into consideration the affordability and the overcrowding. You can see little Alfred Wu illustrations of overcrowding there. But yeah, it's taking into account a lot more factors now, which is resulting in a lot bigger number that cities have to plan for. So for example, Berkeley in the last cycle had to plan for 3,000, to accommodate 3,000 new homes. This cycle, it's 6,000 or 9,000. So it's a very big increase. And a lot of cities are nervous about that, but we're excited as housing advocates. And we want those homes to be near, amenities that already exist, like transit, like jobs. And that's what we're asking for. So the gap in this whole process is enforcement. The HCD, the Housing and Community Development Department of California, is the agency that enforces these housing element laws. And it's pretty small and it's not very aggressive. And so, there's a whole set of laws of how you need to do your housing element, how you need to plan for growth. But there's not the enforcement to make sure that cities are acting in an appropriate way and planning in a good way. And so that's where we come in as housing element watchdogs and housing advocates. not going to play this video. Hopefully, I'm going to pause it because I think it's distracting. But basically, cities, unfortunately, and I've worked for a city. I worked for the city of Los Angeles, so I have like a deep empathy with civil servants and with public sector workers. But it's true that especially a lot of elected officials who want to keep their more wealthy residents happy and like feeling like the status quo is being protected, cities really do try to get around the housing law. This video, which I can send a link if you'd like, is about the city councilors saying like, hey, like the way that we do this is we find housing sites that HCD will approve, but housing will never be built in, right? And one of our watchdogs, Josh Albrechtson, posted this tweet on the right where he actually went through the site inventory for South Pasadena this cycle and, found these sites that like could never accommodate housing, but they were identified on the housing inventory list as like accommodating low income homes. And so we found that like cities really do try to get around their responsibilities. They don't have a genuine will to build housing for their residents and for the people working in their city. So that's part of our work is to find out when they're doing that, let HCD know, and sort of be like a watchdog that's like standing beside the state to say like, hey, look at that's a bad actor and they're not really genuinely trying to fulfill the law. So our solution is advocacy and enforcement. We have two main strategies. One is to build political will, to get volunteers into public meetings, to write letters, to say to their elected officials, hey, we really need housing for all these reasons. And, so in the housing element process, please do your best to make generous laws to accommodate housing, especially for lower income, because that's the most challenging. The second is to catch bad actors, before they get a certified housing element, to catch out those mistakes where they're trying to skirt the housing law. So those are kind of our two.
Draw them elsewhere in the district, not over Taiwan.
Okay, cool. Sorry, if you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand. That's totally fine.
I have a question.
Yeah, please do.
Jess, could you say more about what happens when someone, they're a bad actor and they say that all these places count for housing, but they truly cannot accommodate all the housing that we would like to have? Does it just not get built and that's it? If they had, is it that we want them to change their zoning laws to allow for actual housing? Like, what would be better than identifying fake places, and what are the negative consequences of identifying fake places?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So the consequences is that the housing won't get built. If it's too small, like that other example where Josh found a property that was like 15 feet wide. Like supposed to accommodate low income housing. So it's like, there's no housing will get built there. So, the ostensible goal of housing families won't happen. So that's bad. A lot of times, you're right, they are trying to get around rezoning, right? Rezoning, requires environmental review. It's a harder political lift. A lot of times residents feel like a rezone is changing the character of their neighborhood, because things that are now allowed to be built there might look a little different than what exists there now. So it's a harder political lift for more sensitive elected officials. And unfortunately, like a lot of our cities have just had the same zones for a long time. And we've been having more children, and we've been, our economic sectors have been growing, and our zoning has sort of been crystallized, right? There's not an adaptability there. And so we would like them to rezone to have that capacity, especially to build those products that are a little bit more affordable, multifamily housing, especially when that's near transit, jobs, food, amenities, etc. So the consequences for a city not meeting their RHNA, right? Like, so these are goals. If they don't meet their goal, it's not like the city is gonna, like if they're, I don't know, there's a few different levels. So that on one level, they need to have a good plan and have good sites for their plan, right? If they don't have good sites for their plan, they could be out of compliance, and there's a bunch of consequences for being out of compliance with housing element law. If they have a compliant element, and then they also don't build enough housing for those goals of the existing plan, then they might have like SB 35 kick in, which requires permit streamlining. That's a whole other conversation. So and they also might get more allocation in the next cycle, because the COG, the Council of Governments, might see them and see like, you accomplished 5% of your goal. Like, you're not going to get a pass on the next cycle because of that. So again, there's like a lot more down that road, but it's a really good question, Joanna. Okay, cool. So those two approaches, right? The build political will, catch them in the act. You know, what we do in the campaign for fair housing elements is to empower watchdogs and organizers to make cities braver by providing pro-housing comments and changing the conversation around housing, right? Housing is a good thing. It's not a nuisance. Identify where cities are ignoring the law, like we discussed. Also to pressure HCD to enforce the housing laws, right? Like we talked about, a lot of them are just technicians, they're analysts, and we want to stand by them to say like, no, this is an important law enforcement issue. You need to, you need to enforce the laws that you've written and the guidebooks that you've published. Like, you need to be strong here. We're seeing this actually tomorrow in San Diego. San Diego is pretty much approving a housing element that the state has said is inadequate. They've made very minimal, and in our very strong opinion, like not enough of a change. So we're really curious to see if the state actually enforces the conditions that they put on San Diego. So it's the environment is kind of changing all the time, and we want to be there to be that strong voice of housing. So there's a bunch of different things that you could do as a watchdog to accomplish these goals of the campaign. One is just monitoring your cities. You know, what are they talking about in these public meetings? Are they talking about the housing element? And, you know, doing that public outreach that they're required to do. Attend meetings and speak up. A lot of our YIMBYs are really good at this. Others, it's like very nerve-wracking to speak up, and that's okay. It's not for everyone, but it can be fun. Report back on public meetings to create a record. This is really important. We want to know what's happening in those public meetings, and seeing if the cities are verbally trying to, like, you know, telegraph that they're getting around the laws or actually wanting to fulfill them. There's ground truthing. This is classic, kind of like what Josh did, and what Joanna was kind of talking about is like, you know, are the sites that the city identifies for low-income housing, especially, are they adequate to you know, hold housing, or are they in a marsh, or do they have a bunch of power lines through them? Those are all things that do happen. And then review housing element drafts, right? Like those big documents, those big plans, they're kind of interesting to read through and see like how does the city see itself, and how is the city going to solve its housing problems? And then more, there's a bunch of things that like can't be listed because they're based on like your unique strengths, and that's also really exciting. We also love the campaign because it's an opportunity to collaborate with some of our allies that we don't always get to collaborate with in housing advocacy. So one basic, you know, local organizations like the one that we're in now. I also wrote down Greenbelt Alliance, they're here tonight. SB at Home's here tonight, Allison, East Bay YIMBY, East Bay for Everyone. I'm not sure where everyone is coming from. I saw Jesus in the room too, from Generation Housing. And these local organizations are great for kind of, you know, bringing in new folks, organizing in your local region, and really speaking to the conditions on the ground in your local spot. And then, you know, we've also seen other groups form around faith communities, school groups, and then of course there's Yes in My Backyard with YIMBY Action and YIMBY Law, and we of course would love to collaborate with you too. So the final thing is that if you haven't signed up yet, I know a few of you have already. I'd love if you go to fairhousingelements.org/volunteer and check out the form there. It's a super simple form. It helps us know what cities you're interested in particular. And then you're on our list and you can see all the tools and resources that we're offering. It's fun to kind of choose your cities that you're interested in. It could be ones that are around you. It could be your hometown. And yeah, if you're on our website, it's that like top menu one over to the right, volunteer. And yeah, we'd love to have the urban environmentalists on our list because you guys bring a really great perspective. I also encourage you to check out Greenbelt Alliance's material. They have some interesting, I don't know if you've released it yet, Zoe, but spoiler, they're coming out with housing advocacy material that is specifically about sustainability and trying to avoid sprawl and building into other species environments. So thank you so much for having me. Please, get on our list. We'd love to have you in our community. And again, thank you for all the time. And I'll be here if you want to chat questions to me for a second during the other thing, but I'm really excited to hear our next speaker too.
Awesome. Thank you, Jess, for the super thorough and awesome overview of the housing elements. I've actually been doing some work on Pinol's housing element through my work with East Bay for Everyone, and it's super exciting and super interesting to dig into their specific parcels that they're trying to build on, and seeing that there's definitely some infeasibility there with, houses that are up on a hill that's in a fire zone and probably can't be built on. So it's great that we're doing that detective work up front. And then pivoting on to our next guest, I'd like to introduce Janani Ramachandran. Janani is a social justice attorney and community advocate running to represent California's 18th Assembly District in the State Assembly. She has previously served on the Oakland Public Ethics Commission and currently serves on California Commission on Asian and Pacific Islander American Affairs. Janani is a graduate of Stanford and Berkeley Law, who is engaged in direct legal services and policy advocacy efforts to improve access to justice for all tenants, workers, small business owners, and survivors of abuse. She previously worked at a community health clinic as a home visiting case manager, serving pregnant immigrant mothers experiencing housing insecurity and mental health crises. And I'll leave it at that, and I'll let Janani introduce herself more thoroughly afterwards. But I'd like to also pause and make a quick disclaimer about Urban Environmentalists. Currently, Urban Environmentalist does not endorse candidates, and we refer to our members to endorsements from other local pro-housing organizations. We do, however, have events with individual candidates, such as Janani, when they request to speak to our members and are willing to host any candidates whose platform overlaps with our mission. So with that, I'll let Janani take it away.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here and meet all of you. As introduced, my name is Janani Ramachandran, and I'm a candidate for California State Assembly. This assembly race is a special election due to the vacancy of Rob Bonta becoming our state attorney general. There are 22 days left to turn in your ballots if you live in most of Oakland, Alameda, or San Leandro, and registered to vote. You would have probably already gotten a ballot in the mail. Special elections have super low voter turnout, so even if you haven't decided on a candidate, or if you have, tell your friends in District 18 to vote. And yeah, so I'm happy to start telling you a little bit about me and my background, and then happy to answer some questions as well. So as introduced, I'm an attorney. I do social justice work. I've been a community activist for a long time. I'm a former ethics commissioner, and I'm also a tenant. And I say that because in our state assembly, we only have 2 tenants out of 120 lawmakers. And that impacts some of the policy decisions that we've seen come out or fail to come out of our state legislature. And I'm excited to run for this seat because, like many of you, I don't want to just sit around and be okay with the fact that we have a state Democratic Party and a supermajority of Democrats that says housing is a human right. without taking the policy actions to actively make that a reality, which is why I'm fighting for a handful of specific policy measures to get to the place where housing can be a human right, including enacting a true eviction moratorium during the pandemic, and a moratorium on foreclosures as well. Our current eviction moratorium, SB 91, expires the very day after this special election, which has not been getting the amount of press coverage that I believe it should, because millions of California tenants will be unfortunately facing eviction extremely soon. About 40% were not able to take advantage of the rental relief program that was included under SB 91 for various reasons. So this is the beginning of a really scary time for tenants across the state. I'm fighting to repeal Costa-Hawkins and the Ellis Act. I was involved in helping draft, being part of the original coalition that got AB 856 on the table that Alex Lee ultimately introduced. I want to make sure that housing is a human right, not a commodity, and Ellis Act evictions prevent that from happening. I'm also fighting to, like probably every single one of you in this room, build more housing to get closer to our RHNA goals. And personally, as a lawmaker, I would want to focus any initiatives that I bring about on our low income and very low income categories, which is extremely, extremely important in Assembly District 18. I think we can start to do this by repealing Article 34 and getting back redevelopment dollars funneled into cities. I also believe we need to take active measures to end racist redlining policies and really root out the vestiges of these incredibly discriminatory practices, and upzone in order to work towards a dream of 4 floors and corner stores near high-density transit. I also care a lot about addressing homelessness from a more strategic angle, because right now our state spends over $13 billion on homelessness services, and our state auditor herself has said that we don't know, whether this money is at all going into evidence-based intervention and meeting the needs of our unhoused communities. So there's a proposal called Roadmap Home 2030, which combines housing production, tenants' rights, and homelessness services, and is a kind of 10-year model that I would look to pass legislation along the lines of. I also want to address, the root causes of help address some of the root causes of poverty, violence, racial and environmental inequities by raising the minimum wage, by enacting universal health care, by implementing a Green New Deal with the racial equity lens. I don't think it's good enough that we will ban fracking in 24 years. I believe we need to start doing that now. In Oakland and my district here, there are a Black child in West Oakland is 6 times more likely to suffer asthma than their white counterparts anywhere else in the Bay Area because of decades of environmental racism and pollution. And I want to, start enacting policies to make sure that we're holding corporate polluters accountable, to make sure in other districts that where there is active drilling, that we're implementing buffer zones along the lines of SB 467, RIP. That was very upsetting, that fact that didn't pass. And really take action on climate change, starting by not accepting contributions from the oil and gas industry. That is a huge roadblock, in my opinion, to getting true environmental policies passed. Over 70% of our lawmakers do accept funding from the oil and gas industry, and over 90% accept funding from PG&E, which as an investor, as an incredibly problematic investor-owned utility, is a big roadblock, in my opinion, to holding them accountable for the harms that they have actually caused. So I'll stop there, and happy to answer questions, have dialogue, hear your feedback and thoughts out of what you would want out of a state lawmaker. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Janani. I'll start off with some prepared questions, and then we'll open it up to the whole audience for questions. And I think given that it's a pretty small group tonight, that when everyone else has questions, they can just raise their hand in the chat and then introduce themselves and then fire away with questions. So let's see. Yeah, so you mentioned that your special election is occurring because of Rob Bonta being nominated up to Attorney General. That's really exciting news as well to see him, rising up the ranks and being really successful. I'm curious, what are going back to the housing policies of today, and we see a lot of environmental policies that are kind of getting shot down right now in the state Senate and the Assembly. And we'll see if that happens with the housing policies as well. But what are your thoughts on some of the various state legislation in the works to help facilitate more housing construction, and kind of like the 4 floors and corner stores that you alluded to? So some of these bills include SB 9 and AB 1401, which reduces the parking requirements. I'd like to hear your thoughts on those, and then also I'd like to hear your thoughts on what do you feel is missing in the current housing conversation in Sacramento?
Yeah, definitely. As far as what's missing is the tenants' rights piece, in my opinion, because while I undoubtedly support upzoning in all cities, particularly those that are majority, where residential neighborhoods are majority zoned for single-family homes, I do believe that we have to implement, we have to upzone with the tenants' rights lens. So I'm aware in the entirety of the Bay Area that over 80% of all residential housing zones are zoned exclusively for single-family homes, and that's certainly a problem. But because Costa-Hawkins is still around, I worry that in a place like Oakland, blanket upzoning without tenant protections can lead to displacement of long-time rent control tenants, which is why I do generally support SB 9 because I believe there's a provision to specifically that prevents displacement of existing tenants in the neighborhood. I'm glad that Berkeley has passed as a city. It's, the beginning of ending exclusionary zoning, and Oakland is on its way to start setting up a committee that's going to explore ending exclusionary zoning. And I hope that by the time in Oakland, which I'm the most familiar with, I'm hoping that by the time that actually happens, we would repeal Costa-Hawkins or at least introduce vacancy control by then. And to me, that's important because even in a new multifamily unit that has a certain percentage of housing that's slated to be affordable, in Alameda that's 15%, in Oakland it's either a certain number of units or paying a certain affordable housing fee to the city. The issue is that those units remaining affordable. And without Costa-Hawkins, these units do not get rent controlled and will be able to be susceptible to the market, to unfair flows of gentrification of people in and out. So I think the two together could be great for housing, repealing Costa-Hawkins while upzoning, while creating new transit. I do support AB 1401, ending the parking requirements. And were there other specific bills that you mentioned? My thoughts on?
No, those were the two that I highlighted so far. I think we have a rapid fire thing later on, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, I think another thing to couple AB 1401 with is, the obvious. We need to invest in public transportation. I am. Yeah, BART's great, but I'm really a fan of AC Transit. I always have been since I was a kid. And especially in law school, I went to Berkeley. I never took Lyft. I never took Ubers. I really just took the bus pretty much absolutely everywhere. But I recognize that this comes from a place of privilege. I lived right on a bus line. I took the 6 bus up to law school, down to my internship in downtown Oakland, to home, to wherever I needed to be at any given time. And it was free because I was a student and had that pass. I just remember very vividly the day that pass expired, recognizing, oh my gosh, this is $2.50 to go, a few stops one way. How incredibly inequitable is this? I also recognize that, while I took public transportation literally everywhere, a lot of my clients, even when I was doing eviction defense work and other legal aid work, would take 3 buses in 2 hours to get to my legal aid office. And similarly, an incredibly long amount of time to get to courthouses and to get to essential services. So I think that we really do need to invest in emission-free public transportation, particularly in the communities that don't have it, which in this district includes a large swath of East Oakland and most of West Oakland, which have truly not enough bus lines in particular.
Yes, it's been really sad to see the transit cuts, especially during COVID. I went to Cal for undergrad, and I took the 65 bus up to go to work during undergrad, and I'm pretty sure that bus line has either been suspended, or it's only running like once an hour these days because of COVID. And if I were there now, I wouldn't even be able to have worked that job because I didn't have a car in undergrad. And so this definitely, impacts poor communities even more so. And especially recently, just trying to get to SF on BART on the weekend, it's a 30-minute wait if you miss your train. And at that point, a lot of folks aren't even going to want to, take transit anymore, and it kind of becomes a death spiral. And so we totally agree we need to, keep increasing our transit funding and get things back to at least where they were pre-COVID, and then improve upon that going forward. I think so. Going on, I think you mentioned in your platform on your website that you're a fan of social housing, and I know recently there's been a lot of excitement with Alex Lee and Buffy Wicks and their social housing bill, and I think East Bay for Everyone was working on a social housing white paper as well. How will you work with Alex Lee, Buffy Wicks, and other housing advocates to pilot social housing in California?
Yeah, big fan of Alex Lee, who has endorsed me in this race, which is awesome because we align a lot. And he frankly ran a campaign similar to the dynamics of mine and won, and I've taken a lot of lessons from him over the course of the past few months. And he certainly has given me advice, but it's also been frustrating to see a lot of his legislation not make it through the assembly for various reasons that have to do with the fact that we don't have enough corporate-free candidates in office. We don't have enough folks that are there that are truly championing progressive reforms regardless of the odds. So Buffy Wicks is great too. I've worked a little more closely with her team on some workers' rights legislation, but I think I'm really thrilled that she is co-sponsoring the social housing bill. I mean, because the reality is, yes, I want, and I mentioned that I care a lot about within the whole issue of we need to build 250,000 units a year over the next 5 years to help supply start to meet demand. I'm personally invested in focusing on the low-income and very low-income categories for arena goals. But it's extremely, extremely hard for private real estate developers to do because the cost of land is too high, the cost of constructions and permitting. It's for developers, and for small minority-owned developers in Oakland who I've had some interesting conversations with, who truly want to create affordable housing for their native city of Oakland. It's extremely hard because of some of those realities, and with the fluctuation of being the labor force for building and construction. And there's a lot of complicated reasons why the government needs to step in, and the private market cannot do affordable housing alone. And if we continue at this rate, we're never going to get closer to those goals. So that's why I support social housing programs. And I think the pandemic is going to make it easier to have a broader cross-section of individuals who are interested in this as well. It's not going to be, just the progressive lawmakers who are pro-social housing. I think it's going to be a lot of folks. I also really do see Article 34 as a roadblock. So, and one of my initiatives would be repealing Article 34 so we can get to a place where it's not so difficult for local jurisdictions to be able to build affordable housing. And I think that could tie well into the social housing bill that's already been introduced.
Awesome. And just for everyone on the call, Janani, could you give a 30-second overview of what Article 34 does and is?
Yeah, so Article 34 basically requires local jurisdictions to have ballot measures if they want to. I mean, the short form is you have to pass a ballot. Voters have to pass a ballot measure if you want to build public housing. If you have a better paraphrase, please please go right ahead.
No, that's great. Thank you. And cool. So I guess kind of pivoting back towards the urban environmentalist focus. So we're really focused as an organization on designing cities around people rather than cars. How do you think that the connections between car dependency and our ability to tackle climate change are? Like, how do you kind of think about that interconnection?
Yeah, I mean, emissions coming from cars are one of the largest sources of greenhouse gases in the state, and it's certainly a concern of mine. But it goes beyond, and I know there's been a lot of emphasis from particularly the Newsom administration to focus on CCIs and credits for electric vehicles and rebates and things like that, which is fine, great. You know, we should move towards, if someone has a car, hopefully it's an electric vehicle moving forward. But that takes away from the equity lens of all of it to me, which is we need to make sure that public transportation is emission free. And not just emission free in wealthy neighborhoods, but emission free in the neighborhoods that are EJIC communities and are ones most affected by existing high levels of pollution. So personally, I would focus on using some of this Biden infrastructure dollars that's about to come in addition to our $100 billion budget surplus, which everyone wants a slice of, but I think there's no greater urgency than addressing our climate crisis than now. So it's certainly going to be one of my focuses with using that pool of money, plus what we're getting from Biden. But yeah, in order to build emission-free, high-speed public transit that is truly accessible. I also support, forgetting the number, but there's a bill right now regarding bus lanes on the Bay Bridge. I think that's a great start to making getting across our bridges without cars easier and providing alternatives to our train systems for those who need it. I personally took the bus across the Bay Bridge a lot on the F line from the East Bay to San Francisco, but dedicated bus lanes are going to certainly help that. I think also dedicated bus lanes everywhere is important. The number of times I feel like I've been on AC Transit where there are accidents because when there are no dedicated bus lanes is super problematic. I don't know if it's all of San Francisco or most of San Francisco that introduced dedicated bus lanes that significantly improved pedestrian safety, as well as fewer cars on the road ultimately too. But yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I agree on the bus lanes. I think we just installed them on Broadway in downtown Oakland, right next to my apartment, and it makes it much more walkable because the cars, at least not as much. They're not racing each other in two lanes. They have to stay in the one lane, and it just makes it a safer environment for everyone and more efficient for the bus driver and all the passengers. So yeah, hopefully we get that on the Bay Bridge in this cycle, but if not, we'll keep pushing for it. Cool. I think I'll ask one last question and then hand it over to the audience for any remaining questions. Do you have any thoughts, Janani, on innovative opportunities to maximize the climate benefits of new housing? So for example, focusing on housing that is car-free, kind of like what AB 1401 is going for, or having all electric housing, or housing with like integrated green space. Any other suggestions you have on that front?
Yeah, and all of those things are ideal. And I think that like right now we have incentives like density bonuses for developers that want to build higher density housing and affordable housing, and many of those benefits trickle on there. I think we should start implementing that for developers who create, who build environmentally friendly buildings as well, low emission buildings, solar panels, etc. I do know that AB 1309 with the solar credits was problematic, so I want to make sure that we don't veer down a path that benefits only those who can afford solar to get the credits and not have those benefits trickle down to everyone else, because we should expand the use of solar energy. But yeah, no, I think we need to start incentivizing production that is not only affordable and high density, but also green.
Awesome. And I may be making this up, but I think I remember in some cities they were considering adding density bonuses, like you said, for all electric new construction. So that'd be really cool to see coming into the real world. But with that, I'll hand it off to the rest of the audience for any potential questions. Feel free to raise your hand in the chat, or just unmute yourself if I don't see you.
Looks like we have a question from Remy.
Hi, I just wanted to know, Jenny, your thoughts about this whole rent control thing, because I actually have some acquaintances that live in rent control apartments. You know, they're fairly wealthy folks. They own other real estate, and yet they just stay in the rent control apartment because they're paying very low rent. And you know, they rent out their other real estate for market rate. So what's your thought about just getting rid of rent control and going to a housing voucher system? So you know, that would allow builders, you know, basically freedom to build apartment buildings without having to worry about rent control, and they just accept, you know, government vouchers. And we could, you know, use taxation of the super wealthy and the corporations to pay for these vouchers. And similarly with Prop 13, getting rid of that, which is basically rent control for homeowners, and again, go to a tax relief voucher system based on income, similarly. So want to know your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that what you said about the second proposal sounds great. I support getting rid of Prop 13 because I've never heard it phrased that way, but that's exactly what it is, rent control for homeowners in a way that has significantly impacted our budget and our spending on education and many other things from pre-Prop 13 world. So I think that's a great idea, and I'd actually want to look into that more, that kind of voucher system for tax relief as an alternative. As far as rent control goes, you know, I'm open to exploring creative alternatives, but I do support rent control and its expansion, partly because I sincerely don't believe that it leads to stifling housing production. When Berkeley and Oakland passed much stronger just cause and rent control ordinances, that did not negatively impact housing production. In fact, based on the fact that the East Bay was gentrifying and there was an influx of people and industry, housing production did increase for several years. The issue that you mentioned of folks that are wealthy, that are landlords sitting in rent-controlled property, it's really nuanced, and it's a discussion that I know a lot of folks involved in the TOPA movements are having right now, and the Tenants Opportunity to Purchase Act movements, because which, you know, ultimately is meant and designed to stimulate homeownership. And I certainly support that. I believe that I want to have as many policies enacted as possible that's going to get to a place of homeownership. But when introducing TOPA, which gives tenants a right of first refusal, or nonprofit developers who are building affordable housing right of first refusal, the question is often, you know, how do we make sure it's the tenants who actually should be benefiting from that opportunity, low-income tenants specifically. The question is, how do we make sure they're the ones who are the ones benefiting from these laws? But yeah.
But Jenna, you didn't really address the issue of of many, wealthy, tenants who are in rent control apartments and are getting a subsidized rate because of their length of tenancy, not necessarily their income, which basically takes that housing unit off the market for affordability and leaves less housing units available for younger people who make less money, or other workers who make less money.
I mean, so repealing Costa-Hawkins would give cities the freedom to reintroduce vacancy control. So we could have a higher number of units that are rent controlled if we repeal Costa-Hawkins. So yes, while the individuals that are wealthy would be able to benefit from low rent, vacancy control would allow more individuals to benefit from properties that are similarly lower rent.
How would that work exactly?
So I think we should move on so that everyone gets a chance to ask a question. Thanks.
Cool. All right. I see, Cliff, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. And thank you, Janani. I'm not an 8018 resident, but I appreciate you coming to speak to us. So my question is about Sequa. Most of us are here because we want to support the environment and protect the climate. And obviously Sequa has been beneficial in a lot of ways, but we also see that it's being used to block bike lanes and transit expansion and infill housing in a lot of places. And I'm wondering if you think Sequa should be reformed somehow, what your feelings are.
Yeah, I think that we need something to make sure that we are thinking about environmental protections while building, but don't necessarily think that the status quo way of Sequa working is impactful. It seems like it's sometimes used by NIMBYs to say, oh, let's require Sequa so that our plants aren't impacted by a lack of sunlight from this multifamily unit or whatnot. And that just seems to be a cop out for deciding that you don't actually want this high density housing next to your house. I think Sequa also neglects the importance of transportation and pedestrian safety, and doesn't really look at that impact. So if we are we should have some kind of environmental review that takes into consideration some of these other factors, including proximity to public transportation and pedestrian safety. So to me, I want to certainly reform it so that we can think about how it can be used as not just continuing the status quo and make sure the status quo doesn't change, but being used to facilitate improvements so that we can think about the benefits to the environment of certain types of development rather than just, oh, how will this harm the environment, which involves, time and money for sure, but Sequa already involves time and money for often the wrong reasons.
Thank you.
Cool. I think we have time for one more question if anyone has any. I don't see any hands up yet.
I guess I could ask a question. I don't think I can raise my hand since I'm the host. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on kind of the conversation about how to bring in environmental improvements like bike lanes and transit improvements, green space, and so on into low-income neighborhoods that have historically not had their fair share, kind of while making sure that the current residents benefit and avoiding concerns that are often raised about potential for gentrification.
Yeah, I think we can certainly do these things if there's priority to start in low-income neighborhoods rather than ending up with bike lanes, bus lanes being high-speed transportation, emission-free transportation being implemented the last in low-income neighborhoods. new individuals moving into a community does not always mean a bad thing. I think California particularly is a state that has historically been comprised of various individuals from all over the country, all over the world, seeking refuge. And we, I think, need to be accepting of new individuals into spaces. And I think that there are many reasons why people choose to move to the Bay Area, for example. Certainly, yes. For some people, it is tech jobs and the money that comes with that gentrifies community, yes. But there are also LGBTQ individuals who are personally unsafe in their home states or countries that choose to move to places like the Bay Area, for even from other places within California, for better life opportunities. So I don't want to have the state version of xenophobia and saying that no one should ever move to Oakland, or no one should ever move to some of these existing communities in the name of gentrification. I think we can allow new people to come in while having an equity lens to that. And that starts with kind of what you were going back to, what you were saying initially, which is prioritizing low-income communities with some of these pro-environment housing and transportation support first rather than last.
Great, thank you. So I think we should start wrapping up. Janani, do you want to discuss how people can get involved with your campaign?
Yeah, absolutely. I will actually have Emma put some things into the chat. But yeah, there are a couple of ways you can all support. You can volunteer. We have weekday canvases and, weekday phone banks and weekend in-person canvases. You can request a yard sign or have other people request a yard sign, or you can request them for someone that lives in the district. You can make a contribution if you feel called to, and you can certainly spread the word with just 22 days left. Any support telling people there isn't even a special election is incredibly helpful. We unfortunately think this is going to be a very low voter turnout race and want to make sure that the highest number of folks, particularly progressives, show up to actually cast their vote. So yeah, thank you. And I'm going to put my email there as well. Feel free to reach out if you want to continue the conversation. I recognize that housing and environmental policies are very nuanced and complex, and it's hard to express the full range of things in a short amount of time. And I'm also, I aspire to be the kind of lawmaker that never assumes I have all the answers, but want to work with folks who have expertise in certain areas to make sure I'm coming up with the policies that are the most inclusive and equitable and efficient.
Cool. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Janani, for taking the time to meet with us tonight. And thank you, Jes, as well, for your overview of the Housing Elements campaign. I think with that, we can go ahead and wrap up, unless anyone had any final questions to sneak in. But looks like we're all good there, so.
My email to the chat too, if you have any further questions or want to get further down the rabbit hole of housing element policy.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you, Jes. And thank you, everyone, for coming out and chatting tonight.
Thanks, everyone. And join us in the next event and check out www.urbanenvironmentalists.org.